Hey folks, it's Tom, your frugal prepper. It is, let me show you here, all snowy and nasty outside the garage. But it is all nice and warm inside the garage. Got the heaters going. So it is time to get these pistons in the engine. So I'm working on that, and yes, it's probably possible to do this a lot faster, but I like to take my time with it and just make sure that this critical step is done all right. So I've removed my connecting rod here. On this particular engine, and most engines have some sort of identifying mark. Many engines will have a number stamped on the up and down side that go together for like the number of the cylinder. This one has dots. So it's got like dots on this side and dots on this side of the connecting rod cap, and those do not exist on the other side. So there's no dots there, but there's those 4 dots there. Those 4 dots need to go all on the same side. And that's how you know you've got this thing in the right orientation. These are basically cast as one piece and then cracked apart or cut apart, and then they're honed or you know, honed out to be an exact circle. So if you flip them over, they'll be off and they won't line up perfectly. So make sure, you know, if you haven't built engines before, that needs to go in the right orientation. So I pull that off, and you know, I clean my surfaces here all real good where my bearings are going to go, and just make sure that that looks good. And then I've got this, what I like to do, just take a little bit of brake clean here and kind of spray in the rings where my grooves are going to go. Try to be careful not to wash my number off the top. I don't want to lose track of which piston is which. I just like to make sure this is all good and clean. And I'll show you what I do here. Alright, so what I like to do is just put a towel here in my vise. And then just take and gently place the piston in here and just snug it up. Just enough so that it doesn't want to move. That is really all we're looking for. There, that's perfectly fine. So in this bottom groove on the piston is where our oil ring goes, or our oil scraper. This basically, these rings just scrape that layer of oil off so that you don't get a whole bunch of oil coming up on these other rings. And so the key here is you want to put these on, but you want to try to be careful not to scratch up this face of the piston if you can help it. This isn't a brand new piston, I'm reusing the old ones, but you still want to try to keep it nice. Now, your piston ring pliers, at least these piston ring pliers that I have, will not grab this ring because it's just not thick enough for it to grab it well. So, like if I take my top ring here, you know, this one's thick enough that it'll grab a hold of it and expand it for you. So what I usually do on these is just try to very carefully put them in here while rubbing the face of this piston as little as possible to get it down in here. Kind of get it down and in that groove. And then you can, some people will put the second one of these on and then put this in between the two. I prefer to put that bottom one on. Then I put on this little brass doodad here. Get it all worked around in the groove. Let me see here. Get it all lined up in there right. You're just going to kind of work it till you get it in there. Okay, so now if you can see, we've got the one ring, and then the brass thing, and then this other little ring will go in there. Get down here in this third area. Just kind of make sure they're all lined up there, and that they can kind of move. And that looks good. So I'll kind of zoom in here and see if I can show you. So I've got them all lined up here, and see everything moves nice and free. That's the important thing, is you want this to move freely in all directions and make sure it's all in there good. Now what you want to do is where your gaps are on these is clock them and make sure they're about a third, at least a third of a turn away from each other. On this oil scraper, that's not as big of a deal as the compression rings. Okay, so we're ready to install our two upper rings. So what I've always been taught is that there's a top and bottom to many rings, especially it seems like your second ring. So always look for a dot. Okay, a lot of times there'll be writing on the top, but a lot of times it'll just be a dot or a divot. But the other dead giveaway as to what's the bottom, and you probably can't really see, but there's a slight bevel on the inside edge of this ring. So where that bevel is on the inside edge goes towards the bottom. Of the piston. And then on my top ring here, there's writing on one side. You know, it says standard 1.2 and this one says standard 1.5. But there's no bevel. I mean, there's a slight bevel on the inside edge, but it's equal on both sides. So this is probably one of those rings that can go in either direction. But since the other one with the bevel down puts the writing on top, and often where the writing is the top, I'm going to put the writing towards the top on this one. A lot of aftermarket performance bearings will come with an instruction sheet. Chinese eBay rings do not come with an instruction sheet. So that's what I'm going with, is the bevel always goes down on this ring, and we'll put the writing towards the top on this one. The other thing that I like to do is, because your rings ride in these grooves and they do turn as the engine runs, they move around, and you want them to be able to turn very freely. So what I do is just take a small fine file and I'll come right in here on this edge and just file pulling down just a little bit to make sure there's no burr there where they cut that ring. Just like so. And then towards this inside edge, I'll just do this corner a little bit. And I'll feel along this outside corner. If you do these, especially on a chrome ring, you will make sure you come from the outside edge in. You don't want to flake that chrome off and have a rough edge there. Let's just make sure so we don't have any burrs right there. They're not hanging anything up. We'll do the same little thing for the top ring. I'm not doing a whole lot of pressure on this. I'm just very lightly going over in here to make sure there's no burrs. Then we'll do the inside corner and this inside corner. Now this inside corner has a little burr on it that I can see. Not very big. We're going to file that down real good there. Okay. And then we'll do the outside corners pulling in again. Just a little. Alright. So those are all nice and smooth now. We're ready to go ahead. Put this on. Again, the beveled edge down, the writing side up. This has to go into the second groove. So I get it in the pliers, and then I get it started in the back of the piston. And then we'll just let it come down forward. And then we're just going to make sure that it moves nice and free, and that every part of it can turn free in that groove all the way around there. Feels really nice. Then we'll do our top ring. And I have to find the writing on it again. Here's my writing side. It's going to go up. So, also, like, I've always found, like, you can do these pliers, I guess, either way. Like this way or this way. I always find it's easier to do the flat part towards the top. That's how I prefer to do it. This ring's a little thinner. Let's see if we can get her on here. Seated in the back. Bring it forward. Okay, so now I'll zoom you in here to show you this. So we see here like these two gaps and these rings are the same. And so just like we did on those bottom rings where we kind of made sure the gaps offset by about 1/3, we want to bring these rings off by about 1/3 or so too. At least 1/3. And what that does, it's called clocking your rings, and that makes it so that if the air gets through this gap on this ring, a little bit of air, you know, it doesn't have another gap right underneath of it. That, you know, the air's got to go through one gap, then, you know, through the other gap. So, you know, the air's got to come down through that gap, go around, find a gap, go around, find the gap, you know, so that, you know, it eliminates excessive blow-by. That's what you're trying to do there. So everything looks good on this guy. So now I'm ready to go ahead and put my bearings in. I'll go ahead and do that next here. This is a pretty simple process. Let me get my bearing out. So both these bearings have an oil hole. They're actually pretty much an identical bearing, except the part numbers on opposite sides, which I don't think it even matters. So you see here, the cap does not have an oil hole, and the bottom of the piston will have an oil hole. Right here. And I also made a note that this is slightly offset to this side where this oil hole is, goes towards the exhaust side of the motor, so I'll know that when I'm reassembling. And we see here we can pop this down in just like so, get it level. And that right there, perfect. And our oil hole and the bearings right over top of our other oil hole. So I'm going to put this back for the moment. Now this one, the other bearing, both bearings have an oil hole in them, which is fine. It's just that this one won't really be used for any oil. There's no oil hole in here. You can see there, that bearing is installed. So that's all pretty straightforward. What I'll do is put a little assembly pre-lube on each of these bearings. Like so. It's all pretty straightforward. You can also put a little assembly pre-lube on the sides here. Just a little bit where that's going to kind of be up against the crankshaft. And so our rings and bearings are installed. Now we're ready to work on dropping this guy in the engine, and I'll show you what we're going to do. Alright, so now that my rings are on, we want to check a couple things before we go ahead and compress them down. So the two things I need to check really is on the top and the second ring. I want to check my gap, or what they call that side clearance, piston ring side clearance. So I see on my specs, the top compression ring needs to be from 1.6 thousandths to 3.1 thousandths of an inch. So I'll grab my feeler gauge and we'll maybe start with 2 thousandths. If I can find it here. Here's 2 thousandths. So basically you're just going to slide this in and make sure that that clears, you know, right here. Pretty great. So put that ring all the way over, right, and slide this in. And if your ring's all the way in, that's a pretty tight fit, but it just has a little drag. So it's a tight 2 thousandths, that's within spec. And so we look at the compression ring, the second ring clearance is from 1.2 thousandths to 2.8 thousandths. So again, I'll just measure that with the 2 thousandths, see how that fits. It's a little bit tighter, so I'm going to have to come down a little. So I have a 1.5 thousandths feeler. Tiny little guy. It's paper thin. There, that fits good. So I'm at 1.5 thousandths, and my minimum spec on that guy is 1.2. The top one I'm at 2 thousandths, and my minimum is 1.6, and my maximum is 3.1. So I'm within spec on that. So now we're ready to just double check the clocking on our rings. Make sure they're at least a third away from each other. Looks good. Right there. And we're ready to get that piston ring compressor on. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is compress my piston rings. And I have my good old trusty piston ring compressor that I've owned since I was a kid. I think I got it at Sears back in the day. What I like to do is I've already cleaned this out real good with brake clean. If there's any rusty spots on it, just like wire brush those down, make sure it's all nice and real good and smooth inside. And it is. So what I'll do is take a little bit of just 10W30 engine oil. You do not want to use assembly pre-lube on your rings. It's too much lubrication and they need friction in order to seat. So I just make sure this is lubed a little with some good grease or engine oil. I'm just using some 10W30. I could use 5W30 because this engine does call for 530, but a little bit for assembling it's not going to hurt a thing. And then we basically want to take this and get this down over our rings and everything, like so. Okay, and then we're just going to tighten this little ratchet device up. And this is going to squeeze our rings in. We'll make sure this thing is straight, like so. That should be good enough. So now we'll drop this piston in, and the piston will go in, and the piston ring compressor stays, you know, outside the motor, and the rings will slide right in there, hopefully, and we just tap it in with the back end of a rubber handled hammer. Okay, so pretty much the same thing here. I want to make sure everything's clean, nice and clean before I do this. So I'm going to take a little bit of brake clean, right, on a paper towel, and just clean out my cylinder. And then I'm going to re-oil it, but I want to make sure all the dirt and the dust particles are out of it. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and flip this engine over. And I'm going to take my, I want to make sure I clean my rod bearing journal on the crank on number 1. Make sure there's no dust on that guy if I can, as well as I can, you know, make sure. Okay, now we're ready to go ahead and flip it back over. Get you a paper towel and some oil. Since we cleaned that cylinder out, we want to make sure we got a nice coating, a thin coating of oil on our cylinder, like so. That way it's not going in there dry. Now, as you can see, when I put this piston ring compressor on, I left a little gap here at the bottom. You can see where this isn't all the way down. That's important because I want to locate the piston and get it started in the cylinder, and be able to get that kind of pre-located before I start tapping. The other important thing here is, which way does this thing need to go? So the exhaust side of my engine, up here's my intake side, this is my exhaust side back here. And I know that this oil ring needs to go towards the exhaust side. What I'm going to do is double check my notes though, just to make sure before I do this final assembly. So I know that each one was the same. Here's a bag that's got my old rings and stuff in it here. And so what I want to do is look, and I have oil port to exhaust wrote on the top of the bag. So I know that that oil port right here that's off-centered there needs to go towards this exhaust side of the engine, or towards me. The other thing that I have to pay careful attention to, because this has dots on the one side here, okay? Those dots have to line up with the dots again on the rod cap. However, once this is seated up against the crankshaft in there, I can't see those dots anymore. So with the oil port towards the back, it puts the dots towards the back of the engine, or the oil port towards the exhaust, it puts the dots towards the back of the engine. Now you wonder why it's so important. There's a little oil ports on the side of these connecting rods that squirt oil out as the engine's running, and you want that oil squirting in the direction in which the engine was designed to squirt it. So if you're putting these backwards, these little oil ports are putting oil towards the other end of the motor. So it's just, that's the way they designed the oil system to work, and that's the way you want to put it back. There's one more thing we got to do before we assemble this. Right now my journal is all the way at the bottom. I want to take and put these little plastic covers on these rod bolts again. I had taken them off while I was playing with it. So that will prevent those threads from tearing up the journal on the piston. Oil port here is towards the exhaust, towards me, dots towards the back. And we're ready to go ahead and tap this bad boy in place. Make sure this is seated good. Okay, now we just tap it home. I like to use the plastic end of this hammer. We'll tap this thing on home here. Start out nice and slow. Keep downward force on your piston ring compressor. Keep it pushed up tight against the side of the block, or the top of the block. And there is an installed piston right there. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this motor over. I'll keep my hand here. This piston shouldn't come flying out or anything, but you never know. So now we'll just make sure, pull this out here, make sure this journal is right at the top, and then I can reach down in here, grab this guy, get it seated up here, and there we go. Now that's seated up. We can go ahead and take our plastic protectors off. Easy enough. And now we got to check our clearance for our connecting rod. Let me look up that specification. So we have 0.00039. So I think that's what they call 3.9 mils. And so what we want is going to be less than a thousandths, which I can't measure, but up to 2.6 thousandths. So that's pretty tight clearance. Our best bet is to go with the green plastic gauge here, which can measure, I believe, down to 1 thousandths. So this can measure from 1 thousandths to 3 thousandths. So we'll see where we're at with it. I could definitely can't tell if I'm hitting my minimum spec, but since this is the factory crank that's just been polished, I wouldn't expect to be at my minimum spec. So we got 80,000 miles on this crank. Tear a little piece of plastic gauge off there. Stick that right across. Try to make sure this is straight. And my dots to the back. Throw this down on here. And then these have a top and a bottom. This is the bottom. You can just tell which side's been tightened up against there before. I don't know that they have a top and a bottom, but I can tell which side was on the bottom before. So I'm putting them in the same orientation. So now I gotta torque these. And they're gonna go, the first pass is 18 foot-pounds, and then the final pass is another 80 degrees. Okay, so I've got my plastic gauge under here. I've taken and put a couple pairs of vice grips around this one balance piece just lightly with the towel to keep them from marring it up, and that just keeps this crankshaft from rotating while I'm torquing everything down. So the first step is 18 foot-pounds. That's what I've got this torque wrench set to. So I'm just going to kind of get them snug. Should click any time here. There, okay. We'll do this one. Okay. So now I gotta set up and do an 80-degree measurement here. Looks good. There. So we'll find our 0-degree mark right here, and we're going to go 80 degrees, which is right here. This might be a bit of a problem. Just trying to get this 80 degrees of movement above these vice grips, but we'll see what we can do here. Boy, that's a lot easier than the crank bolts. Took one with 0. Turn her around to the 80 mark. Okay, now we'll break her back open and see what the plastic gauge says. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and crack this open. Okay, now hold this up to our gauge. And that's the millimeters. We want the standard. So it comes in at 2 thousandths. Maybe just a smidge smaller. It's between 1.5 thousandths and 2 thousandths. And our specification, let me find it again. Shaft bearing. Connecting rod bearing is 0.39 thousandths and 2.6 thousandths. So we are well within specification on that one. So now I'm going to go ahead and clean this plastic gauge off. And then we're going to check our end play here on this connecting rod journal. So now there's some sideways movement on this connecting rod and cap here, and there's a specification for that, and we want to measure that to make sure we're within spec.